Most people think the Nazca Lines are a mystery because we don't understand them. But that's not actually the problem. The real problem is this. Why would an entire civilization spend centuries building something that they could never fully see? Because from the air, the Nazca Desert looks like a blueprint. Precise lines, perfect shapes, animals stretch across kilometers. But if you're standing inside it, you see almost nothing. No image, no pattern, no meaning. Just shallow lines in the desert. So what were they actually building? And more importantly, what problem were they trying to solve? Because every explanation, whether it's astronomy, some sort of ritual, water, or even aliens, keeps running into the same wall. And if you don't see that wall, none of this will make sense. Let's start with what's actually there. The Nazca Lines aren't one drawing. They're not even a collection of drawings. They are a landscape system. And they are spread across southern Peru, around Nazca and Palpa. And this system includes straight lines that run for kilometers, geometric shapes like trapezoids, spirals, and triangles, and figurative abstract designs, or animals, plants, or even humanoid forms, right? And there are hundreds of them. Some are small enough to miss, and others are so large that they stretch across entire hillsides. But here's the important part. This is not random. Official archaeological documentation treats the Nazca Lines as layered structure. Different categories for different purposes, and they were built over time. So it wasn't just one idea, or they weren't just built in one moment, but it's an actual system that's been carefully planned. And before you can explain the system, let's first date it. Because if we can't place something in time, it will be quite tough to understand why it exists. So the Nazca Lines weren't built all at once. The archaeological evidence places their main construction between roughly 200 BC and 500 AD. So during this time, which is known as the Nazca cultural phase. But it gets more precise than that, because using a technique called buckle up, optically stimulated luminescence, basically measuring when sediment was last exposed to sunlight, researchers found that some of the lines were still being constructed as late as 400 to 650 AD. So this wasn't a one-time project, but we already knew that. It was something that continued across generations, which raises a bigger question. What kind of idea survives long enough to be built for hundreds of years? Now, here is where the things start feeling a little bit strange. Because the way these lines were made is actually simple. They were no advanced tools or some lost technology. It's just contrast. Because the desert surface develops a dark layer over time. And when you remove those darker stones from the top layer, lighter ground appears underneath. And that's it. They were not building something, they were revealing something. And because the region is one of the driest places on Earth, with almost no rainfall and minimal wind, those markings can last for hundreds of years. So the real question isn't how they survived, it's why they were made in the first place. And this is where most people get distracted, because they assume the scale requires complexity, but it doesn't. Because a rope and two stakes can create a perfectly straight line. If you move them forward step by step, and that way you can actually extend the line for kilometers. If you want to scale a drawing, you build a grid. So what you'll do is you'll draw a small version of the drawing, you divide it into squares and reproduce those squares at a larger scale. It's simple, repeatable, and reliable. In fact, this has already been tested. A researcher recreated a full-scale geoglyphs using nothing but basic tools and matched the originals in days. So no, the Nazca didn't need to see the lines from the sky. They didn't need advanced technology and they didn't need help. Which means we're left with a much harder question. Not how, but why? So let's anchor the scale. Some figures, like the spider or the hummingbird, are around 50 meters long. Others stretch in hundreds, and the straight lines they can run for kilometers. And altogether, the system covers tens of square kilometers. So imagine this. You're walking in the desert, you follow a line, it keeps going and going and going, and it has no end in sight. No indication of what it connects to, no way of seeing the full shape, just a movement. And that's where the big hypothesis comes in, which is astronomy. It's one of the most popular explanations. The idea is that the lines align with celestial events, like sunrise, sunset, solstices, and maybe even stars. And on the surface, it sounds convincing. Straight lines, horizon points, patterns in the sky. But here is the problem. If you want to prove something is astronomical, you have to define your targets in advance. You have to account for Earth's movement. You have to test whether the alignments are better than a chance. And when researchers actually did that, the results didn't hold up. Yes, you can find alignments, but with enough lines and enough possible targets, you can always find patterns. And that's basically what the human brain does. It looks for a meaning, even when there isn't any. Astronomy might explain some lines, but it doesn't explain the system. So we move to the next idea. Water. And this is where things start to make sense, because this isn't just a desert, it's an extreme desert. Water here isn't just important, it's everything. The Nazca developed underground channels, and they are called puquios. These basically tapped into groundwater and brought it into surface. Rivers in the region were unreliable, and they were flowing only a few years out of a decade. Can you imagine that? So water wasn't guaranteed for them, and it had to be understood, managed, and most importantly, respected. Which means it wasn't just practical, it was sacred. And suddenly the idea that the Nazca built large-scale markings connected to water isn't so strange at all. It's kind of expected. But here's where we hit the wall. Water explains importance. It explains symbolism. It even explains location. But it doesn't explain the scale. Why this big? Why something you can't see? So let's try another idea, which is the ritual. Some researchers suggest that lines weren't meant to be viewed at all. They were meant to be used, walked, and experienced. And there is evidence for this. You have basically compacted surfaces, objects that are placed along the lines, paths that look like they were made for movement. So imagine this. You are not looking at an image, you are inside it, walking it, following it. And suddenly the size makes sense. Because it's not about seeing the whole thing, it's about moving through it. And this is where things get actually interesting. Because a recent study using AI identified over 300 new geoglyphs. But more importantly, it revealed a pattern. Smaller figures tend to cluster along informal walking routes. Larger, more structured shapes appear within formal geometric networks. You have two different systems, two different scales, and two different types of experience. They're individual and collective at the same time. So this suggests something powerful. The Nazca Lines weren't one thing, there were multiple layers of behavior happening at the same time. Now let's come back to the idea of code, because this gets thrown around a lot. But if something is truly code, it has to meet certain conditions. You need basic elements, rules for how those elements combine, a way to handle errors, and some kind of external reference to decode it. Without that, you don't have a code, you have interpretation. And most decodings of the Nazca Lines fall into that category. They feel meaningful, but they're not testable. So here is a better way to think about it. What if the information isn't symbolic? What if it's behavioral? What if the lines don't communicate something to be read, but something to be done? To gather, to walk, to coordinate, to remember. Because that is still information, just not the kind we're used to. And once you see it that way, the wall disappears. Because the assumption was wrong. The assumption was that the Nazca needed to see the lines, but they didn't. They needed to experience them. And finally, there is one more thing. These lines only exist today because of the environment. Minimal rainfall, almost no wind, and no vegetation. So in almost any other climate, they would have disappeared within decades. Which raises a question that's far bigger than Nazca. What else like this has already been erased? How many civilizations shape their landscapes in ways we'll never know about? Because their environment didn't preserve it. Because what we call history isn't everything that happened. It's only what survived. So where does that leave us? The Nazca Lines aren't unsolved mystery in the way people think. They're not impossible, they're not beyond human capability, and they're something much more interesting, in fact. A system built over centuries, using simple tools preserved by physics, and shaped by human needs, movement, belief, survival. Not one explanation, but actually layers. And maybe the most uncomfortable part of all of this is this. We expect meaning to be visible, something you can stand back and observe clearly. But Nazca didn't build for observers, they built for participants, and that changes everything. If you like these sort of videos, please subscribe to this channel. I'll be uploading at least once or twice a week, and until the next one, keep thinking.